A lot of people, myself included, have dreamed of space settlement. It feels like it'd be the long-term destiny of humanity to spread out among the vast sea of stars, starting with our own solar system. There are a lot of questions that will need to be answered, from how do we have humans survive long-term off-world to solving the issues of travel time and distance. But one question I've noticed tends to get left out or forgotten in the conversation is that of the law. What does and will law look like in space? Who exactly will own what? And how is finding an answer to these questions not only vital to space colonization, but to preventing interplanetary war? Hi everyone, I'm Stella, and today we're going to be exploring space law, from how it exists in its current forms, to the different routes and reforms that will need to happen as we set out to the stars. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. Firstly, let's look at the current formulation of space law. The main governing document for activities in space is the Outer Space Treaty in 1967. The treaty states that space should be treated as a commons, and that no nation is allowed to claim sovereignty over any celestial body. This in of itself isn't that much of an issue. It doesn't say you can't build settlements. It just says that the celestial objects those settlements are built on don't belong to any one nation. However, the OST also states that resource extraction is not allowed, as, like I said earlier, the treaty doesn't allow for national appropriation or sovereignty claims of space objects. Now, for those looking for loopholes, this also extends to private actors as well, so it's not easily circumvented as giving SpaceX a lot of money to claim the Moon and Mars, because SpaceX is still under the jurisdiction of the American government, and so any claims of SpaceX are off-world. Connecting this to the treaties and conventions regarding liability and registration. If something goes wrong, someone will be responsible. This ties back in and applies to both national and private space actors, because ultimately any rockets launched will still need to launch from somewhere on Earth. As such, all activities in space are reported and registered, all kept track of, which is kind of important, because it's good to know what exactly we're doing up there in space. Now, this all sounds well and good, so what's the issue? Well, firstly, most importantly, the OST is incredibly vague. There are a lot of terms that are just straight up not defined properly. What's an astronaut? A space object. Where does the country's airspace end and space begin? Hell if I know! The OST doesn't either. In addition, even though outright claiming sovereignty over space isn't allowed, the vagueness in many aspects of law could allow for functional claims of sovereignty, which not only defeats the whole purpose, but also poses a threat to peace. Because what if nations start fighting over the not quite sovereign pieces of lunar or Martian land? In addition, as I'll discuss later, the rules surrounding space mining are also rather fraught and ambiguous. All this vagueness comes from the fact that the OST was designed to regulate the space activities nearly 60 years ago during the Cold War. However, the geopolitical climate has changed, and with many actors, both national and private, saying the sites are more permanent settlements in space, such ambiguity cannot persist. Now, there was an attempt to fix the OST in 1979 that would have cleared up the ambiguity of space law and established a clear property agreement between nations. It was called the Moon Agreement, and despite being ratified and thus technically in effect, no country that has the ability to launch objects into space has actually signed on to it, letting it to be, to use the professional terminology, a goddamn failure. But what happened, and how was the Moon Agreement found dead in a ditch? In order to understand, we need to go over the different legal property frameworks that are used to manage resources in new areas. The first is res nullius, aka nobody's thing. To use an imperfect analogy, imagine you're hiking and you find a rock on the ground. That rock doesn't belong to anyone, a la res nullius, but if you pick up the rock and take it, it's then your thing. The second is res communis, or collective thing. In this scenario, that rock does belong to someone, usually a collective agency, and you need to negotiate with them on when you are allowed to take the rock and how you can use it. And the last is common heritage of mankind, or CHM, a special form of res communis, and one that is much more recent in development. Here, that rock is the common property of humanity, and you are not allowed to mess with it except under very specific circumstances. Now, this honestly isn't the best analogy, because it's not individual rocks we're trying to govern, but whole celestial bodies. But it should be enough to help you understand why the Moon Agreement failed. The Moon Agreement sets up space under the CHM framework, and will not have allowed any form of resource exploitation, except under the guise of an international regulatory body that would have been created by countries prior to the treaty, with a focus on ensuring the resources gained from lunar mining could be shared between all nations. However, the Moon Agreement was iffy on the details, saying vaguely that the international body would be set up later. In essence, the Moon Agreement was premature, as it was trying to set up a property agreement for space before the technology for it to even matter was developed, while at the same time trying to defer a lot of specific regulations until after all the infrastructure was set up. Because of this, the Moon Agreement failed to get signed on to by any space powers, both when it was introduced and since. No major space power has or had any incentive to sign on to the treaty, go through all the effort to make space mining viable, only to then be subject to an agreement telling you what you can and can't do, and one that would have to make you share resources gained from space mining, including your enemies. In light of this, space law stands at a crossroads, even as space technology advances and space travel becomes cheaper. And so, one nation is poised to push through their own interpretation of law. You know, the good old Burger Eagle United States of America. God, I should take this more seriously. This has been done through the Artemis Accords. Connected to the Artemis program, it is a non-binding bilateral agreement between various US-aligned nations like the UK, India, and Japan. While the Accords do restate a lot of the OST in regard to the necessity of peace, cooperation, rescue, etc., there are two interesting parts of the agreement. Firstly is the allowance of space mining without national appropriation, which I'll talk on a bit later, and the second is the idea of temporary safety zones in space missions. Now, safety zones are a legitimate concept with precedents in maritime law, and though they definitely aren't sovereignty, they are one of the examples I mentioned earlier that kind of pushes the boundaries. For example, the United States could set up a long-term safety zone around a research station on the moon, and could theoretically do this as many times as they want with as many research stations as they want. While America isn't technically asserting sovereignty, it could get pretty difficult to ask them to leave, especially if the base develops to expand the civilian functions present in a normal town, or is in some way developed to form a national significance. This, in my view, risks a zero-sum scramble for space, especially for the most valuable bits of lunar land. And even if it isn't technically sovereign territory, nations might treat them like it is and could even fight over it. And of course, there's the fact that the Artemis Accords favor already established space powers, and in particular the United States. And that would set precedent of major powers being allowed to push through their interpretation of international law in a way that favors them without having to go through the UN, which I think you could agree isn't a good precedent to set. No. With everything in mind, it is clear we need an updated legal structure to regulate activity in space. So what are our options? There's a lot of paths forward, some with more risk than others. In my view, keeping space as a commons is the best overall path forward, because though it definitely won't lead to the quickest development in space nor to maximum profit, even if we treat those things as desirable, it shouldn't be the only thing we consider. Commons law has thus far prevented humanity from getting embroiled in a major conflict over space resources or places like Antarctica, and I think that's something we can and should continue. However, if we want to keep space as a peaceful commons between all nations, we very much still need legal reform to keep it that way. So what direction can we take the reforms in? To start, we could take inspiration from the Antarctic Treaty System. Antarctica is the frigid icebox at the bottom of the globe, and one that had barely been explored even while the North Pole was. And still, despite it being a frozen desert filled with ice and weather that wants to kill you, it still had a lot of countries claiming onto it in the early 20th century, as well as posturing between those countries over their claims, meaning it very well could become a flashpoint for conflict, and yet it didn't, all thanks to the ATS. The ATS, signed in 1959, established the continent as a functional condominium between the signatories of the treaty, and laid out a few guidelines for how the state should act. Firstly, no military bases are to be built. The continent should be for peaceful, scientific purposes only. On that, all nations party to the treaty are allowed to build research stations wherever, regardless of the previous territory claims. And as for the claims themselves, as long as you play nice, you can keep them, but they won't mean anything. All of these things have had a positive impact on Antarctica, keeping the peace and allowing for science to be conducted, which all sets precedent. So, for those advocating for Space Antarctica, this is what you'll need to keep in mind. Long-term space development requires a lot of research, as we need information on how to construct off-world bases, life support systems, and the long-term psychological and physiological effects of humans in reduced gravity. And being at peace generally allows for that research to be done. So an ATS-style system of space would theoretically allow us to get that crucial research done. This all sounds nice and chill. However, there's some things we need to keep in mind before we go about creating Space Antarctica. For one, like the OST, the Antarctic Treaty prohibits any form of resource extraction, despite the fact there's some evidence of resources being underneath the ice, instead wanting to keep the continent for peaceful scientific projects. Copying this over to space law might not make those who dream of industrializing the solar system the happiest, but it does show a very clear legal flowchart what you can and can't do. But this restrictive no mining allowed policy does run into some other issues, namely with in-situ resource utilization. The concern is if you'd actually be able to conduct the research you need under a highly restricted mineral agreement. Knowing how to use local regolith or ice water on the moon and Mars will be crucial for long-term space settlement. In addition, the ATS was created as a solution to prevent conflict in Antarctica after after claims were made. If we look at a map of Antarctica, as mentioned earlier, all the claims made there are still there. It's just no new countries can make claims, and no new countries can rescind or act on their current claims. Because of these factors, both restricting of its mining and its ad hoc nature, I don't think governing a style of the ATS should be our first option. But we should definitely keep it in our back pocket, because it serves an example that even if there was a script for space territory, space could be converted back to a commons, and won't end up with a situation like in The Expanse, with humanity fighting itself in space. Secondly, we could look at how the oceans are regulated to give us a basis for setting up space as commons. I believe that, after the failure of the Moon Agreement, sea law gives us the best hope for regulating space, so let's look at it. The oceans are governed by the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS. Under UNCLOS, every nation gets its own exclusive economic zone, roughly around 200 nautical miles away from the shoreline, where nations get rights to economic activity in the region, while the rest of the ocean is the high seas, or just the area, and is considered part of the common heritage of mankind. However, nations are still allowed to engage in exploitation here, though through the purview of the International Seabed Authority. In theory, nations and companies that want to engage in deep-sea mining reach out to the ISA, and if they get approved for mineral exploration or exploitation rights to a certain region, then the nation or company gets rights to half of it, while the other half goes to an ISA-run enterprise that attempts to use their slice to aid developing nations. I say theoretically because, at least from the research event, no contracts have yet to be handed out for deep-sea mining because of the environmental concerns. But this does give us a solid theoretical framework and set precedent for how a space commons can be set up. However, if we try to apply this to space, we get something that sounds a lot like the Moon Agreement. So then, how did UNCLOS not go the way of the Moon Agreement? Well, it initially looked like it might, but through some compromise, it was made more amiable to the major powers, mainly by removing the mandatory technology transfer requirement, which would require major nations to give away deep-sea mineral extraction technology to developing nations. Not a good deal in their eyes. And now, UNCLOS has been signed by every major power except the United States because they're special, and it's being customary law while giving us a theoretical framework for it. Oh, in fact, the reason the United States hasn't signed on to it is precisely because it set a precedent for space law that they did not want set. But still, if we want to revise the Moon Agreement, this is ideally what we'd want. An agreement that strikes a balance between the demands of the space powers while still meeting the needs of developing nations so that all of humanity will broadly benefit from space exploration. So let's try to imagine what it would look like. Firstly, all nations would be allowed to engage in small-scale extraction for life support, maintenance, or scientific experiments. However, if they wanted to engage in larger-scale mining of an area, whether for export or in-situ colony expansion, they'd have to appeal for mining rights from the International Space Authority, and once granted, they'd get rights to half, while the space enterprise would get rights to the other half, who would have developing nations play a role in helping with exploitation, and in exchange would get some of the profits. This, I think, is a pretty good option for how space mining can be set up and regulated in the future. It continues space as the commons and involves developing nations to allow them to benefit as well, even if the major powers are setting the board on which they play. But there are some other options. I mean, we could abandon common space law and hand the exploration of space to the private sector. I mean, who needs things like cooperation and peace when there's money to be made? No, I'm being facetious, and this video isn't meant to discuss space privatization and commercialization. That's for later time. But space privatization is an ideal hope held by many within the space colonization scene. As such, we must examine it in terms of the current legal structure, namely the troubles it runs into and some of the strategies some might use to overcome the hurdles of current space law. For one, the OST is still in effect and is still binding, as well as being customary international law, so trying to overcome it would be the first challenge to a privately owned solar system. Now, I mentioned earlier one way those in power are trying to get around this is through the Artemis Accords, which might work. For example, the Artemis Accords, as mentioned earlier, reaffirm American commercial space law, namely the Commercial Space Launch Competitive Act of 2015, which states that American citizens and businesses are allowed to engage in commercial space mining in space under the OST, as the United States claims it is not asserting sovereignty over the bodies themselves. In other words, they are applying res nullius to the resources in space, saying they belong to no one, even if the celestial bodies themselves are common. This is one of the biggest purported loopholes within the OST and one with the most political momentum. But there are others, for example, claiming Earth-based law won't apply to people in space, which it does, or saying the failure of the Moon Agreement's absolutely no exploitation meant the OST did allow for some exploitation, which, again, is not how that works. Now, however ridiculous or shaky these loopholes may sound, talking about them does serve a purpose, to set precedent in international law. If enough nations accept the loophole, regardless of its validity, and it becomes customary law, then it is, in effect, an actual loophole. This strategy, with the Artemis Accords and others, is based on the view that international law is too slow to update, which in all fairness, it very much is. That non-binding agreements in domestic law will be faster and more effective in modernizing space law and allowing for space development. But alternatively, what if one ignored that and attempted to reform international law to allow for private property and national expropriation anyway? There's some different potential directions these reforms could go, from a land claim tax to setting aside areas for latecomers and for scientific research. However, they all have one major flaw. They all favor first movers and already established space powers in such a way that no developing nation would want to sign on to it. One could argue all they want about the potential benefits. Without signatures today, it would never happen. Or lastly, we could just go full force with space commercialization anyway and let it lead to a crisis to update the law, or just abandon space law entirely and let people claim whatever. This is what I call suicidally stupid, given that 1, you still need some kind of regulatory body to manage claims and avoid complete chaos, and 2, even with that, it must certainly lead to a space scramble. Without an effective international regulatory body, there would almost certainly be increased conflict and tension, both in space and back on Earth. In my view, common space law has kept the peace in space for nearly 60 years, and I think sacrificing short-term investment and development opportunities for continued peace is a pretty good deal. And of course, there is the question of who benefits. With commons, it's pretty clear everyone is nominally meant to benefit, both developed and developing nations alike. But sometimes the question of who exactly benefits from space commercialization as opposed to space commons can sometimes be left unasked. Lastly, I'd like to briefly touch on space nations. For some, the hope of space colonization is the creation of new countries that be able to explore new philosophical ideas and whatnot. And even though this would likely be far off in the future, as we are nowhere near the technology for large-scale independent space states, the question remains, would this be allowed? The short answer is no. Nations aren't allowed to claim territory in space under the OST, so the same standard applies for new nations in space. But the long answer is a bit more complicated. To start, we need to go over the two theories of statehood, the declarative and constitutive theory. According to the declarative theory, there are 4 main criteria to be a state. 1, a defined territory, 2, a permanent population, 3, a functioning government, and 4, the ability to enter relations with other states. Herein lies the issue. You need territory to be a state, but the OST says you can't claim territory in space. Okay, that's okay. There's another path to statehood. According to the constitutive theory, if at least one state recognizes you as a state, although ideally more, then you'll be a state. Okay, that sounds good, except, again, no state would recognize an independent Martian or lunar country, as their mere existence is a violation of international law. Uh-oh. So does that mean there's no path forward for stellar sovereignty? Well, maybe not. Self-determination is a huge norm in international law, and it states that a group of people have a right to self-governance. However, it's not as simple as just invoking the right to self-determination because of the norm of territorial integrity. In order to invoke the right to self-determination, they need to prove that 1, they are their own culturally distinct people separate from any cultures on Earth, and 2, they are oppressed. Now, the first one is easier than it might seem. Unique cultures can arise pretty quickly from isolation. And this is especially true for 225 million kilometers of distance. But it might be more challenging to prove persecution. It is going to be incredibly difficult to start colonies in space, both on research costs, material costs, and the cost of transporting people being very high. So they're likely going to be filled with higher income, specialized intelligentsia for a while. Though, considering the hostility of space to human habitation and need to be in self-contained habitats, as well as the ambiguity of ownership under the OST, invoking persecution might not be impossible. But none of this may even matter because of your friend and mine, geopolitics. Going back to what I said earlier, no country will recognize an independent state in the commons because the legal precedent would set. Would that allow for an independent state in the high seas, or would West Antarctica finally be able to claim 50% of unclaimed Antarctic land? I don't know. This gives a fraught path to stellar sovereignty, but maybe it's a good thing. There's no rush to create independent states in space, especially if it ends up causing more conflict. So let's focus on creating a solid legal framework for space that allows us to understand and develop the technology needed for space settlements, and then we can focus on interplanetary independence. To wrap up, even though kind of unavoidably slipped in, this video was not designed to share my beliefs on what space law should be, but rather I made to show that space law is an incredibly complicated topic and it is one I am far from an expert in. I wanted to give an introduction to this topic and show that it's something that will need to be given serious consideration for any advocates of space colonization. It will impact space settlements. It cannot and won't just melt away when you colonize the moon and Mars and melt whatever your desires are, and it's something we must keep in mind, because the legal precedent we set in the next few decades will forever affect humanity's future in the stars. I'd also like to thank Kelly and Zach Weinersmith and the book A City on Mars for inspiring me to research this topic and make a video on it, as well as helping me with a lot of fundamental research. I highly recommend the book because it goes into a lot more detail than than me, and covers a lot of challenges to space science, both legal and scientific. It's also where I got the fun term Space Arctica from, so thank yous. Well, that's all for this time. If you have any questions for me, you'd like to share your thoughts on the topic, or if you have suggestions on how I can improve my videos, please comment down below. But other than that, be sure to like and subscribe because apparently saying that works, and I'll see you all next time. Bye!